Hi guys, and welcome to your feedback video on this month's assessment. This month we're going to do things slightly differently. Whereas before, you've had like a PowerPoint to work through or a worksheet. This month, basically, all we're going to do is I'm going to talk you through the mark scheme, and we're kind of expecting you to make annotations as you're going through it. A bit more independent than what you're used to. Obviously, I am going to give you all the relevant commentary, and some exemplar answers have already been put onto Moodle for you to access, which you might want to print out on your own. But yeah, we're just going to go through the mark scheme together. Obviously, all you've got to do for your teachers is annotate your scripts accordingly, get that back page filled in with the feedback, and then submit it to your teacher by their requested deadline. A couple of things for you to do before we get going is firstly work out what your percentage marks are on both of the relevant sections. Obviously, a lot of you are still struggling with research methods, so it's good to understand kind of comparatively where you're going right and wrong. And then the other thing is to just work out kind of where you are in terms of the grade boundaries. So on this paper, the grade boundaries were as follows. Starting at the top, there was 39 marks for an A star, 35 marks for an A, 30 for a B, 25 for a C, 20 for a D, and 15 for an E. So anything below that, you obviously got a U grade and failed to pass it. It's just good to always work out how far you are away from your target grade or your aspirational grade. So if everybody can just do that before we make a start. So once you're ready and once you've done that, we'll just start working through. We'll start on the attachment section. So the first question was pretty well done. It's pretty straightforward. It was only multiple choice. The correct answers were, as you can see here, D and E. A few people got a little bit muddled up, I think, by the kind of negative question, which was the effects are not irreversible and not permanent. That was one of the correct options because Lorenz did actually say that the effects were permanent. He said that we attach to the very first thing that we see, and that is irreversible. So you're always going to be attached to that person. So yeah, a couple of you went wrong there, but they were the correct options. The second question was really, really well done. I think you all had very good knowledge of this area. Most of you were able to name these 3 stages of attachment with absolutely no problem. However, what I will just kind of draw your attention to here is this bit, where it says to name 3 stages of attachment. So whilst a lot of you did indeed name those 3 stages, what you also did, which was kind of wasting your time, was you outlined them as well. I saw this a lot in terms of my classes, which meant they'd run out of time later on in the paper. So it's all about kind of understanding what the question wants from you and knowing what the key kind of directives are within a question. So when it says name, it literally means name them. You don't have to do anything else. I've had a couple of my students say, well, I thought I best do it just in case. You really don't need to. All you have got to do is follow the guidance that is in the question itself. So some of you did waste time. Like I say, not dropping marks for it, but certainly not doing what the question is actually asking of you there. The next question, what is meant by reciprocity in the context of caregiver-infant interaction? A number of you dropped a mark on this particular question. You only gave, if we look at this, you only gave really a limited or muddled definition. So you basically said that reciprocity is an interaction between the parent and the caregiver, where you basically said the mother does one thing and the baby does another. It needed to be elaborated. So rather than just saying it's a 2-way mutual process, you could have said that it involves turn taking, or that they instinctively know how to respond to each other. So the behaviour of one person elicits a specific response from another. A lot of people picked up the second mark for giving an example, which you can see here, 2 marks for a clear, coherent definition of reciprocity. You could have done what I said there and elaborated it, or you could have added an example. However, just be careful with that, because it does say do not credit examples unless these add to the definition. So for those of you who just provided an example, it wouldn't have gained any credit at all. Just to clarify as well here, the example of kind of like a baby smiling and the child smiling back, unless you've explicitly said that that's turn-taking behaviour, that would actually be interactional synchrony, which I think a few of you are still getting muddled up with. So that one, just annotate that very quickly. Obviously you can see where you've been given credit. If there was anything missing from your response, then you need to add that on now. Moving into the next question, this was quite a poorly done answered question, I would say, and it was because it was quite difficult to interpret this question. So I'm going to take a little while on this one to really kind of clarify some common mistakes here. So, first thing that I want to draw your attention to is that the question says to evaluate, all right? So you should know by now at A-level psychology that to evaluate means to give strengths and weaknesses. A number of you just clearly didn't understand what this word actually meant, and a lot of you were kind of describing the theory and also describing research studies. Now, there were 3 different kinds of responses to this question, and I'm going to take you through each one and say which one was the best and which one was the worst. So, the first and best type of response that we saw to this question was the ones that you actually referred to what it says down here on the actual mark scheme. So, they'd interpreted the question correctly. So it says, briefly evaluate research into maternal deprivation. People who had given the best answers had understood that the research into maternal deprivation was conducted by Bowlby. It was the juvenile thieves study. And in order to answer this question correctly, they had evaluated that study. So they had done this, what it says down here. They'd made reference to extraneous variables. They'd referred to kind of like researcher bias. A lot of you were mentioning this idea that World War II was going on at the same time as that piece of research, which they then had said that means you can't establish cause and effect between kind of maternal deprivation and affectionless psychopathy. Again, the best answers had also included this point here, so that there's a lack of clarity between separation and privation. So Bowlby's research may have actually been investigating privation rather than maternal deprivation. So for those answers, they would have, in all likelihood, got into this level here, okay? Now, the second type of response that we saw was unusual in the sense that it wasn't really doing what the question asked for you to do. So the second type of response that we saw here was students who were offering the Bowlby juvenile thieves study as supporting evidence for maternal deprivation. Now, technically, we did give you credit for it because this word, research, on certain mark schemes, on certain areas of the syllabus, actually means theory and or studies. So those people who had used the piece of research correctly, i.e. they had said Bowlby's theory supports the maternal deprivation theory by showing that maternal deprivation does result in affectionless psychopathy, and then they'd used Goldfarb as well, they were given credit. However, because they hadn't really done it in the way that we'd expected them to do it, i.e. they're not giving strengths and weaknesses of the studies, they weren't necessarily getting the full marks, okay? So whenever you see this question in future, evaluate research, it means give strengths and weaknesses of research studies. You can get away with giving evidence as long as you use it correctly, but that's not really what we would expect you to do, and you can see that that's not included on the mark scheme for it. So obviously, I said that there were 3 categories of answers. The third category of answer were the ones who just wrote about the juvenile thieves study. Now, the juvenile thieves study, as we've already said, could have been used as supporting evidence, but for anybody who just described that research, they got 0 credit here because you're not actually answering the question, which is all focused on evaluation. So reread your own answer now and kind of see which type of response you have given. Have you given the first one, the best one, the middle one where you've not answered it correctly but we've given you some credit for it, or have you got nothing on here so you need to kind of totally go back to basics and have a look at what should have been included? Once you've done that, we'll obviously move on to the next question. So the question was, briefly outline what research has shown about multiple attachments, and it was one of the better answered questions, I would say. A lot of you were really, really confident in terms of using findings. So you can see down here, the findings that we were kind of expecting were from Schaffer and Emerson, and a lot of people gave correct and accurate percentages. So for that reason, you can see they were going to get 2 out of 2. Anybody who got 1 on this question, it's probably because you just said this last little bit here. You didn't necessarily have any findings as such. You just said attachments can be formed to different people for different reasons. So it's not really specific enough. It's not really detailed enough, but it does show some understanding. So obviously, I appreciate that the findings and all the numbers are really quite difficult to learn. But for questions such as this, you're going to kind of put yourself at risk of not picking up the marks if you don't know at least some of the findings. Moving on to the next question, which again was pretty well answered. We had a lot of students kind of in this level here, so getting 1 and 2 marks. So I'm just going to say what we saw in the vast majority of students. Like I said, most people got 1 or 2, and then what else you could have said in order to achieve 3. So most people were saying this here. Oops, excuse me. Sorry, that's a reminder. So we've got this first bit here where it says fathers tend to be secondary attachment figures due to a lack of sensitive responsiveness. So most of you did say that the dad was a secondary attachment figure, and most of you then followed it up by saying that he is a playmate rather than a caregiver. We also saw some kind of general reference to these biological and social factors. So most of you did have this good understanding that dad has to go back to work, therefore he's not spending as much time with the baby. He's a playmate rather than, a provider of food and things like that. Furthermore, mum's got kind of biological hormones such as estrogen, which make her a little bit more nurturing. So some really good understanding. However, the better answers were the ones who also referred to legitimate findings, so this bit here, where infants and fathers who are more engaged and sensitive tend to be a bit better at problem solving, and also the really good answers stretched it and said that whilst father is normally secondary, he can in some certain circumstances become the primary caregiver, i.e. in single parent families. So pretty well answered. You can see what you should kind of like be putting in there if you want to get 3 out of 3, what else you need to maybe add in to your answer there. Moving on then to the last question on the attachment topic area, and it probably was the best one. I think a lot of you really improved your marks by doing a good solid mini essay in here. The first thing to just mention though, for those of you who didn't get good marks, was that you didn't understand this. The word discuss threw some of you off, and you didn't acknowledge the fact that you had to both describe and evaluate. So AO1, which is outline, is worth 4 marks. AO3, which is evaluate strengths and weaknesses, is again worth 4 marks. So some of you were going to be capped in here because all you have done is describe. Focus mainly is on description. Any evaluation is of limited effectiveness. So that is explaining kind of why. Frustrating for some of you, because I've no doubt that you would have known what the evaluation points were, but you just weren't addressing the word discuss. So we'll start on the right hand side here by just looking at some material for the behavioural essay, for those of you who did that one. A lot of you had really good kind of like opening paragraphs saying that all behaviour is learnt. Some really good understanding of classical conditioning and really good kind of use of terminology. For example, saying that the mum goes on to become conditioned stimulus. Operant conditioning was also done really well. Some really good reference to primary and secondary reinforcers. It is really important to note though here that you only had 4 marks of description available, so you didn't actually need to do both classical and operant conditioning. If you'd used correct terminology, you could have got your 4 marks legitimately just by doing either classical or operant. The evaluation was also really strong, so most of you focused on using Harlow and the contradictory findings from Schaffer and Emerson. I didn't really see many people who got this muddled up. I was really impressed, if I'm honest, with your knowledge of kind of like those contradictory findings. So yeah, some really solid responses with the behaviourist approach to explaining attachment. The Bowlby essays were just as strong, but I do have to just make sure that you understand, as I've just said with the classical and operant conditioning, it's only worth 4 marks. Some of you gave Bowlby's theory in its entirety, which therefore meant you wasted a little bit of time. And also you have to consider that if this was a 16-mark essay, what else could you possibly included in your answer? And for a lot of you, the answer is nothing. You kind of went way overboard, so you need to be practicing how to maybe kind of cut that down. The evaluation again was really good. Some really strong use of Schaffer and Emerson. Some really good use of kind of the implication stuff as well. Overall, there was some very strong commentary here. I was really pleased with the fact that the vast majority achieved really good marks on this miniature essay. So, all in all, the attachment topic area, very strong. So we're now going to turn our attention over to research methods. So, research methods